The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. Chapter 14, Vacancy. The attic held the heat from yesterday in its mouth like a balloon ready to burst from too much air. Darnell soaked his lungs in the musty heat and whispered a warning to his eyeballs against the dangers of melting. His body hurt all over from last night. The rafters bled what little life that remained in their grainy veins into the air in a slow-motion stream that filled the sharply pitched room. Insulation popped up pink and cloudy amid the old scattered photographs under Darnell's feet, hiding the dangerous soft spots of the ceiling below. In every picture, Darnell saw the wooden man taking bites of people's shoulders, licking their bones clean, smiling greedily. The wooden man and his walls would shadow Darnell's presence until his daddy left for work and his mama slept again. Josephine would approach him now, he knew. The doll had crawled out from under his bed in a throbbing cloud of light this morning and returned a lifeless carcass to Josephine's room. He knew she would see his fingerprints on Rachel's hard skin, invisible though they may seem, and she would know that it was he who had damaged her so violently with a razor and ill will. Stay low, he thought. He knew his daddy would see the paint he shaved from the living room wall and blame his mother. He would have to let it happen. You knew I didn't take his money, Darnell said to his mother, dirtying up the tub below. You knew it was Josephine who did it, and you didn't do a thing to stop him. His skin moaned black and blue. Josephine would know, of course, about the paint about her doll. She had seen Rachel's mangled limbs, and she recognized Darnell's smell and touch on her skin. Darnell now hoped Rachel's cuts would remind his little sister of who still had the blade and who did not. Why didn't you say something, Josephine? Why didn't you tell him? Darnell turned the razor blade in his fingers and sliced away the blank spaces in the snapshots where the wooden man stood ready for his next taste of human flesh. Let's see if you don't tell now, Josephine, he said, pushing heat from his mouth. You better not tell this time. Darnell took the hot air into his lungs slowly. Soon it would be too hot to stay up here. The air would scorch him and drain all fluids from his boy body. Then he would have to erupt in a great gasp from the inferno of this attic. He just hoped his father will have blown over by then. In the bathroom below him, the running water halted, and Darnell held onto the rafters as he walked the balance beams that spread out below him in an uneasy grid. The wooden man whispered up through the walls, Maybe your daddy won't go to the kitchen to get a bite to eat while your mama soaks in the hot water, and as he passes through the living room, maybe he won't see your fingerprints I point out to him on the wall. Maybe he won't see me there at all, waiting to fill him with what's left of me, to devour him from the inside. Darnell could see it now, his daddy's slowing steps on the living room carpet, his daddy trembling at the thought of his runaway wife returning to the freshly painted walls to reverse her mania in a violent, insane act of cutting and scraping. Jared hadn't even heard it happening, just as he hadn't smelled the paint a few nights before. His daddy felt sick when he thought of how he couldn't stop it. None of it, ever. No amount of scrubbing could clean this filth from the disgusting evidence of her deeds. The wooden man oozed more words. Your daddy might back up to the bathroom again and push your mama down under the water and flood her lungs with death. Her eyes might roll. The fetus might try to get out. Maybe that little baby will claw at her and scrape at her and turn her inside out, turning time back so that you, Darnell, were back in there, and maybe this time you would have sense enough to hold your breath to turn forever blue. Then Darnell heard the struggle, the screams below, of both his mother and his father. In his mind, he saw the wooden man smile. It was happening just as the wooden man said. His daddy did go back. His daddy did put his hands on her. Darnell could see it now. He could see how his mamma's neck, splintered and graying blue, would emerge from under those wooden fingers. The wooden man had found his way into his daddy's guts and hands. In a little bit he would find him there in the attic and get him once and for all ooze into him like he did to his daddy. Darnell's fear and terror evicted the contents of his stomach, and he fell toward the pink insulation, his hands somehow holding him from the impact on the slats of wood on the attic floor. He struggled to breathe and looked for his blade. I suppose it was you who took my money, too. Abra stared up through the water, listening to his yells for her confession, but his fury could not penetrate her. She had seen the sun. Its warmth had become the source of her own strength. His tightly wrapped fingers and hands, the ones pulling at her skin, her throat, could not loosen the sun's hold on her, and she lay calmly, without breathing, watching his lips twist from under her blanket of hot, soapy water. He felt that he could push her through the fiberglass tub if he used just a little more force. He could have pulverized her bones, watched her disintegrate under his wrath, but her lack of struggle, her loving acceptance of his angry, violent hands repelled him from her. His blood rose in a thick, new anger. He stood. Abra eased up and felt the water stream down her trunk. Later that night, she would remember the little rivers flowing down her skin as if they were a profuse sweat erupting from her body after such a close contact with such an immense power as the sun's. I didn't take your money. She spoke, undaunted and fearless, her eyes on his. Maybe you misplaced it. No, Abra, I didn't misplace it, he yelled, unable to contain his rage. Look, he dragged her dripping out of the tub and into the bedroom. Digging in the drawer, letting his belongings spew, his hands did not come across his coins. Never once did they touch the black, jangling sock. I didn't take it. She stood dripping. Then who did, Abra? In her silence, she thought of Josephine's tiny fingers blindly prodding through the contents of this drawer in search of her daddy's black sock. She could hear the voices herself calling her to run her fingers over the drawer's fleshy grain, to free all that is trapped within, and she understood the little girl's sudden compulsion to meddle and thieve. Who, Abra? He yelled again. She closed her ears and set her eyes on him, letting her footprints form, wet and well placed on the old shag carpet. I don't know, she lied. Jared twisted Abra's arms. He pushed her to the ground. For the first time that day, she knew fear. In song, Bernadine and Josephine spoke to the trees. They lay under the canopy of sky and branches in awe of vastness there beyond the clouds. Even in daylight, they could see the stars flash and the planets glowing in the nocturne. With stars nested in their palms, Bernadine's music and the girl's innocent accompaniment drew them away from the crushing house and its inhabitants. A bird hovered by force of habit, a fluttering locomotion of wings, a cool, sleek body. Just as Josephine almost saw it, the bird fluttered away, maybe carrying their song elsewhere to a nearby branch or an acre of air. Bernadine ceased singing to tell her granddaughter, "It's not what you think." I can't find it. Josephine looked up, spinning her glance from limb to limb in the search for the bird. You're not looking in the right place. Bernadine lifted the doll that Josephine clutched in her hands, drawing the little girl's arms up along with it. Then she blew an earth-summoned breath into the hollowness of the facsimile child, Rachel, filling her with a little life of her own. The mangled arms and legs mended themselves, if only in Josephine's mind and vision. Josephine's little doll rose in the air and hovered above them, laughing. Rachel's legs kicked and her arms plowed through the air as if swimming. The doll maneuvered through the sky, adept in all of her movements. Up and down were just a wish away for her. A thought became an action. If Rachel had cried about her new gift, The earth would have trembled with her sadness exponentially. If her fear had dangled her by the neck, left her to scream kicking for the comfort of her former inanimate existence, the world would have dissolved into nothing from her perceived failure. Any signs of hatred of this new life would have only caused a vile eruption from the all-sustaining sun. But Rachel laughed, delighting in the pleasures of being airborne without supporting strings, hands, or machines. By her mere wish, she flew. Bernadine stared smiling at Josephine's awe. Thousand leaves fluttered with joy of this moment of discovery. It was all a little girl could dream, let alone witness or become. Running to my side, Josephine pulled herself on a low branch and snatched at the giggling doll in the air. In thoughts without reason, without malicious design, Rachel inhabited the air in increments and heights of her own choice, of her own making, which made her laugh harder still, flying up and up until her twinkling mirth disappeared through and beyond a passing cloud. Out of reach, out of mind, Josephine's only friend was gone. Josephine didn't understand. She wanted Bernadine's help. How could she make it alone now? She thought in a growing panic. Come to me, child. Bernadine stood behind her, rotated her, and let the rays of her love envelope the girl in her arms. Together they lay on the soft death of fallen leaves under my bow-like branches, and we hummed the little girl asleep. I've heard complaints about time from people. Upon growing up, they often find out how small the world truly was when we were young. Distances that once seemed beyond reason to travel, difficult treks of endurance and will, can be reached in a few breaths, a few well-placed steps. Even time shrinks as they age under the pull of our planet's rotation. Concepts and perceptions of time and space change with their bodies and minds. It becomes increasingly difficult to feel the earth under us and the fluctuations of light, color, and smell. All is stretched to the extreme depth of experience. Perhaps her innate understanding of this was why Josephine chose the bugs as her new allies, with a thought and a wish to disappear for a while. In her sleep, Josephine had willed herself as tiny as a honeybee. On the ground, Josephine twittered her legs in a blur of speed, yet no stone was ever close enough to perch upon for a rest. Only pebbles were present which tended to tumble under her minuscule weight. In the eyes of a neighboring doodlebug, she saw her ridiculous size and laughed. The little bug rolled in on himself, at first surprised to see a girl who shared his size. He feared his death was near. He normally was not afraid of the end, but the abnormality of what he saw now left him cautious and wary. Don't let him bother you, a ladybug giggled. Doodlebugs always hide before they think. It's in the smallness of themselves that they discover the real nature of their surroundings. Then out they poke again. Josephine's eyes lay on her new friend and watched from her little perch on the ground where she saw him, more mighty than ever. The ladybug flew to an ivy leaf by a tree nearly a mile away. Josephine watched it fly through my huge, dangling fruit. My tree, Josephine squealed and ran to me. In an instant, she found herself at the foot of his beautiful, massive trunk and leaned against my bark. A breeze blew the scent of my deep sap through and over her. Stuck in the ooze of my life, she rested slow motion still until the sun went down, and she was dropped, all grown again, and standing in the opening doorway of her home. The water ran hot up Josephine in a deliberate, gradual flood. Darnell sat on the bathroom cabinet and watched her out of the corner of his eye. Bubbles surrounded her, ready to tickle and delight. The light fruity scent overpowered the feral, natural smells of the sweat she had worked so hard for today. She watched Rachel float up to her, pulled slowly around by the rush of water at the end of the tub. The doll's congenial smile never wavered under the layer of bubbles or intermittent splashes and drops. Some girls have all the luck, Josephine heard someone say before, and wondered how far her doll had flown. That's enough, Darnell spit out. He turned off the water and threw the rough, frayed red towel down on the floor. Josephine picked up Rachel and stroked her hair, admiring her pretty face and reattached duct-taped limbs. That's how I'd look at you, Josephine, she heard her grandmother say. I'd stroke your hair and brush it and put pretty ribbons in it. Josephine smiled. I don't know why you're smiling, Darnell scoffed, sitting on the edge of the tub now, looking down into the water, then at the doll. Hi, Rachel. Darnell grabbed the plastic dolly. He dunked her under the water, swishing and swirling her head in a figure eight. Josephine's tiny legs, which had been hiding below the white bubbles, peeked out embarrassed and frightened. Don't, Josephine squealed, pulling the bubbles back up around her. Don't, Darnell mimicked, throwing Rachel, letting her hit with a big splash. Josephine wiped away the bubbles and water from Rachel's and her own eyes. They sat in silence, listening to the water trickling off and around Josephine's body and to the television screaming in the next room. Jared had fallen asleep in his chair, but not before directing Darnell to bathe his little sister. Why do I have to? He complained. Just do it, was his father's reply. Because your mama's gone, Jared thought. Because she left this morning and she won't be back. Now Darnell sat listening to the bubbles pop around the girl with all the secrets. Mama left because of you, Darnell told his sister, who was manipulating the suds into a minuscule mountain range for Rachel to traverse with her new legs of silver. Josephine looked at him, stared for an instant, then went back to beautifying her creation. Did you hear them fighting last night? He leaned in, casting a shadow over her mountain. Daddy said that they shouldn't even have had you. Josephine angled her head away from him and his words. She didn't believe him even though she had heard her father's words, her mama's cries. Mama went away so she could kill the baby, Darnell said. She didn't want to take a chance on having another little brat like you. You know that's not true, Josephine. Bernadine's voice soothed the razor-edge words. Darnell's confused. She just had to get away for a while from your daddy. I don't think she's coming back either. Darnell leaned back, glancing at the door, then back at his sister. Josephine pulled Rachel close to her, not caring whether the froth scattered away from her naked body or into the air. Darnell stuck his head near the water, blew the bubbles away from her. She shivered and tried to listen to the song on the TV in the next room. His waterlogged creases had spread themselves to their resting position, but the sweet scent of soap lingered on his fingers. Darnell stood in the doorway of Josephine's room, listening to her rhythmic ebb and flow of her breath. Was it the moon that pulled those living tides to and fro, or the force of her own will? Jared still lay asleep, smelling of beer and gin on his soft blue chair. He wouldn't stir for hours. Darnell had seen him like this before, but Josephine was usually asleep by the time he passed out. Not tonight. Josephine had walked in a wide arc around him, fearing any sudden thrusts of his hands, any vicious spittle that might fly out on angry words. Darnell spent his father's last half-waking hours tainted by brief but flagrant surges under the darkness of the night sky. He tossed his rubber baseball in the air and watched the Earth's gravity pull it back down. His hand was consistently ready for its return from the brief atmospheric flights. Come sit close to me, girl, Jared had told Josephine that night as she sat on the couch watching the flashing lights and raucous noise of the blaring television. He patted a little spot beside him. She knew she had to go there to his side on his big blue chair. He was hot, moist, and salty around her, and the smell of the liquor made her not want to breathe. Isn't this nice to just sit together, daddy and daughter. He pressed her into his sweaty body. Josephine smiled and nodded, only allowing for necessary inhalations. But even her slow drawing in of air carried his harsh scent in heavy waves. She barely heard the yells between her daddy and Darnell the night before, but she knew what they said. The chair's arm seemed to close in on her as it lost its soft thickness, exposing the wood frame beneath its cushioned flesh. Darnell threw the ball up to the sky, wanting to knock the stars quiet and dark, but the ball would fall into his hand again and again. Time blinked on the VCR clock in seconds and minutes until her daddy's head finally bobbed and fell against the headrest. Freed, Josephine tiptoed to the bathroom, ready for the bath her daddy had commanded. Then later, after smoothing his water-wrenched fingers with dryness and time, Darnell stood in the doorway and stared at the chest of his sleeping sister in her canopy bed of pinks and whites and greens. He stepped closer in to hear her, with his ear to her back. Thank you for listening to The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.